Have you ever felt like your boss just doesn't care about you? Like you're nothing more than a cog in the machine? The harsh truth is that your boss is actually trained to prioritize something other than you. It's called the first team or team number one. And no, you are not part of team number one. And it has little to do with the servant leadership they preach publicly to employees. How do I know? I've been through this training. Here's the kicker though, it's not hopeless. You can turn this around, but only if you know the game you're playing. Now, if you've never heard of Patrick Lencioni, he worked at top-tier consulting firm Bain& Company, Oracle and Sybase, and he wrote 13 books on management, many of them bestsellers. So top-tier companies hire him to train their executives on how to build and manage organizations. Let's take a look at what he says about management and the team number one approach.
I'd like to describe a concept that I call team number one. It's very simple, but it's also very important. Let's say this is an org chart of an organization, and this is the CEO or the head of a division, and these are his or her direct reports. Maybe the head of finance, the head of human resources, operations, sales, IT, marketing, whatever they are. Team number one means that these people have to make this team their number one priority, and that these folks down here cannot prioritize their subordinates or their teams over this one. Let me explain why this is an issue. Let's call this the head of marketing, and these are his or her direct reports. If I were to ask many executives what their number one priority is, this team up here or the one that they manage, many of them with really good intentions would admit, you know, as important as this team is to them, this is the one they consider their most important priority because they sit near these people, they hired them, they really are interested in the subject matter, and they feel a sense of duty to them, and they like being their leader. Now, as natural and common as that is, it's actually very dangerous, because when these people prioritize this group down here, this team becomes like the United Nations or Congress, where people are coming to meetings and lobbying for their constituents rather than looking out for the greater good.
Did you get that? He says that leaders should not prioritize their own teams and should instead prioritize their peers because it's for the greater good. But did you notice that verbal sleight of hand? What is the greater good? Who decides the greater good? The people at the very top, of course. So it's not surprising that usually the greater good just happens to also be what's better for those above you in the organization. Let's listen.
What has to happen instead is all of these people have to make it very clear that they will do what is right for the company or the organization more than their direct reports.
There you have it. The greater good is what's best for the company or the organization. But aren't the people on each leader's team also part of the company or organization? What about them? So what does he really mean? Let's listen.
Now, some people will say, well, where does that leave these people? Well, the fact of the matter is the people who suffer most when we don't have team number one working correctly are these people who are left to fight bloody and unwinnable battles with their colleagues in other departments because their leaders are not working together. So team number one not only serves the greater good, but it allows these people down further into the organization to have a clearer sense of what they need to do and an opportunity to succeed.
Okay. He justifies this by saying it's actually best if leaders don't prioritize their own teams because otherwise the individuals in each leader's organization would be left to fend for themselves and fight bloody and unwinnable battles with their own peers in other teams. Now, I think the whole framing of this is flawed and a kind of one-dimensional simplistic thinking that often runs rampant in companies. And I think it's flawed because it tries to boil down a very complex subject into an easy to follow rule. But if you can simplify managerial skills into easy to follow rules, why have managers in the first place? This kind of training that executives and managers get reminds me of a quote by Aristotle.
Educating the mind without educating the heart is no education at all.
I think great leaders should do it all and adapt to the situation. They need to manage up, down, and across while doing so with a heart. Let's use a family as an analogy. Imagine if the parents only focused on maintaining their relationship with each other, but didn't prioritize their children. What would happen if parents ignore the children's needs, whether it's providing food, emotional support, or guidance? The household starts to break down. The children will feel neglected, act out, and struggle because they aren't getting the attention and care they need to thrive. Even if the parents have a great relationship with each other for the moment, the well being of the family depends on the children receiving adequate attention and guidance. Because the suffering, acting out, and crises that surfaces from neglected children will eventually cause the parents' relationship to deteriorate. But Lencioni does raise a good point that managers can veer too far, focusing too much on just their own teams, developing a fiefdom mentality where only their team matters at the expense of everything else. Back to the family analogy. This often happens where families prioritize their kids so much that the parents don't maintain their relationship, and one day they wake up finally thinking about a divorce while wondering how they got there. So there needs to be balance. I've faced these management challenges myself and was often torn about what to do because I've often observed that managers who care too much about their team generally don't do well in the company in the long term. Being a great manager and a leader is very hard. And the truth is, I've often missed the mark myself. But enough about me. What should you do? As the famous philosopher Bruce Lee once said,
empty your mind, be formless, shapeless, like water. Now you put water into a cup, it becomes the cup. You put water into a bottle, it becomes the bottle. You put it in a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Now water can flow or it can crash. Be water, my friend.
So my advice is to be flexible and adapt. What can you do to succeed at a company when you know your boss is not prioritizing you? First, understand what's good for your team and what your team priorities are. You should be able to get this from your manager and your peers. Second, find out what your company leaders care about and what their priorities are. There's probably a lot that won't overlap completely in what your team does or what your manager's priorities are. So don't just rely on your manager for this. Talk to others from other departments and even other department leaders, if possible, to make sure you understand this from multiple perspectives. Lastly, try to work as much as possible where these two things overlap. Ask for those assignments or volunteer for those projects if possible. This way, you're automatically prioritized because you're aligned with what those above you really care about. Early in my career, I spent a lot of time working on things because my manager asked me to, because I had already spent a lot of time working in that area, so I was comfortable doing it, or because I wanted to make a success out of all the work I had already put into it. But those weren't really company priorities anymore. And in all those cases, my career either stalled or I was eventually hit with a layoff. If you'd like more detail on what specific things you can do, comment below and I'll make a part 2. Also, feel free to subscribe to my free newsletter for more tips that I can't share here. And if you found this video valuable, please hit the like and subscribe. Until next time, stay savvy.